listening to both of you, there's a great deal of consensus about where we want to go, what we want to do with people, and a lot of interest in this broad church, and that everything has a role to play in doing things that benefit people.
Mhm.
But we're also clear that people don't go looking for it. So what's the big obstacle? Why don't people come looking for the right solutions and the right approaches? I think I know part of the answer, but I'm interested to know yours.
It's interesting, isn't it? Do you believe so? There's an assumption there in your question that you believe that people aren't looking and they're not looking and they're not finding the right approaches. Is that right?
That could be right, but even if people do know that they're looking for something, you know, you normally they'll go out looking for coaches. That's the first thing they'll go looking for. And you look at the world of coaching, and everybody's a coach. Even people who don't call themselves coaches are coaches. You know, you could be sitting next to your mate, and I'm using a mental toughness analogy, who's mentally tough. You're somebody that is more mentally sensitive, and
Mm.
he's labeling you. He's labeling you as slow, or you can't keep up with me, or you don't do things with me. They're influencing them. It's kind of damaging coaching, if you like. Everybody's a coach.
Oh, I see. Right. I see.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, and even so-called professional coaches, well, I saw something interesting in conversation with somebody in the EMCC, said less than 20% of coaches use psychometrics in their work. Now, if there's a natural home for psychometrics, it's in coaching. So why
Mm.
do so few coaches use psychometrics? And furthermore, most of them don't use the right psychometrics. So they've been trained in one psychometric and they think that applies to everything. Well, we've already had that discussion that we need to be open and we need to provide the right solution to the right challenge.
Mm.
I'm not sure that, if we were a single coaching organization, that we're marketing our product correctly.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I understand. So I guess where my mind's going with this is it's one of the things that we've noticed as we've been starting to think about terms, and what is a helpful reason for having a term about how we describe what we do. And one of the things we noticed is that coaches tend to describe the area or the people they work with. So you'll have business coaches, executive coaches, life coaches, career coaches. Just they describe the work that they do in the area they work in. Whereas on the mental health side of things, you tend to have a description of the person and their training that they've had.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'd say a psychodynamic psychotherapist or a person-centered counselor and those kinds of things. So in answer to your question, which is why aren't people finding their way to the right people? Um, I suppose from a layman's perspective, all of these things are really, really pertinent to us. These are things that we spend a lot of time thinking about it. But for the average person, in the working world or the non-working world, their access to these things would have probably been quite limited. So traditionally speaking, in the workplace, coaching has traditionally been something that only the most senior people have got. It will be very highly paid executive coaches, often given to the most senior people within an organization most recently. Before that, actually, it was, performance coaching was seen to actually be something that wasn't quite so good. But more recently, having your own executive coach was, kind of something to be very, very proud of, and but quite elitist and quite rare. On the other side of things, if you were to be somebody who is having counseling or psychotherapy, that would probably be because you've got to the point where things have become completely unmanageable. Either
Mm.
you couldn't work or you're having a breakdown in your relationship. You got to the point of crisis, and then either your GP had referred you on to something through the NHS, um, or that if you were lucky enough, you would then have been able to access some private psychotherapy, but probably at the point when things become very, very difficult. I think that really important opportunity that there is now for us as practitioners, and also the world of work and beyond, is recognizing that actually there's a whole place in the middle of the spectrum whereby you can get some really great help that is going to make a big difference to you. And you don't have to be super, super thriving and wanting to get the next promotion. You don't have to be really, really struggling at the end of your tether. You can be that guy in the pub that you described, Doug, who's actually not feeling quite right, wanting to talk about it, and then needing to find the right person who's going to be able to help them work through their problems, help them understand why they're finding something particularly difficult before they get to that point of crisis. And that for me is this sort of interesting space in the middle that hopefully the evolution of coaching will be able to fill in the right way.
That's a really interesting thought, and I really appreciate it coming from you, because you've just stepped down as chair of the coaching division of the BACP. One of the things that I observe is I used to be very involved in a major professional body, and I came out because it wasn't doing anything for members. It was much more interested in fee income than actually providing services to members or guiding members, or even creating an awareness to the general public about what that body was. If professional bodies have got a role, isn't part of their role, a big part of their role, to create that simple awareness? And I'm not a member of the British Psychological Society. I do get their journals, and I have to get the dictionary out to read their articles. It is not accessible. You couldn't look at that with any comfort or confidence. But the world that you've just stepped out from, that has a big role to play in creating that comfort, and that's acknowledgement that this is actually a really good thing to look at. It's not just when you're really scared or you're really down. This is something that's really useful. I'm talking about professional bodies in general. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think professional bodies have got a really important role to play for different reasons. And it's something, again, we've been touching on when we've been thinking about our research into defining, well, what is therapeutic coaching and why is it important that we are starting to define this. What the BACP do very well, I think, is that they've got a really good I suppose there's two ways of looking at this. There's the outward focus, what membership bodies ideally are doing out in the world, talking to policymakers and influencing there, and then reaching the wider world via the media and different conferences and organisations. So that's the outward focus. Then the inward focus is on what are they doing to support their members themselves as practitioners, and resourcing and nourishing and enriching our practice as practitioners. For my experience of being a member of the BACP, which for around 8 years now, since I began my transition into this world, is from a member perspective, and particularly as the coaching division, we're an incredibly passionate community of people who are all learning from each other. And what's fantastic about it is it brings together people, to both of your points that you've made. We're all still learning. And the wonderful thing about what we do is that we're probably never going to stop learning, because the world's going to keep changing, for one thing. So we're going to need to keep adapting. And then we're going to keep understanding as we then evolve as humans in response to the evolving world. So it's an ongoing journey. And we as a community of practitioners, we're coming together, we're constantly talking, we're constantly working with each other to understand the work that we do. And most importantly then, why it's important, how is it going to benefit people? Who is it going to benefit? And to Peter's point earlier, we understand that the work that we do is not going to be for everybody. It will be for for particular people and particular circumstances that would be particularly beneficial for. So I think that's really important, that membership bodies provide a safe place and create an environment where people can come together and openly learn and grow together. And then the other side of things, the BACP have got a really good marketing and PR department, and they are constantly working with the media to give practitioners a voice in the mainstream media around things that come up all the time. So whether that's how people are struggling with the economic climate and how therapy or therapeutic coaching can help, or when imposter syndrome comes up, how can a journalist wants to write an article, how can we offer a perspective on that? Or if somebody has an affair in the press, if you're struggling with that, if your relationship's breaking down, how could counselling and psychotherapy or therapeutic coaching help you with that? So it's bringing these real life case studies into the public domain so people can understand, well, actually, oh, maybe if that person was helped because of that relationship that they had, maybe that's something that I can consider too.
That makes a lot of sense. But of course, the press can go both ways because the press can also create a lot of the problems. There was an interesting article in The Economist in the run-up to the last election when they were pointing out every party, obviously except the Tories, were saying how terrible things were, And it was creating a lot of mental health problems because people were thinking, I didn't realize it was so bad. But, and so the press can actually exacerbate problems as well as solve them. But that's a by the by. I'm really reassured to hear that about the BACP. And of course, I know you've got a new chief executive who I know reasonably well. And I think as an organisation, you're going to be in very good hands there.
I mean, yes, I would agree. I think any large organisation is going to have, I don't want to get into the realms of politics, but I think any large organisation is going to have times when things are difficult. My experience is that with the new CEO coming on board and the leadership team that he's put in place, there's very much a focus on membership empowerment, and we've been very heartened to hear that and to see some of the enhanced communication that's already in place. And I know that, I've just stepped down as chair of the division, but there's an incredible new chair, new deputy chair, and executive committee members who will continue to work really, really hard to ultimately, our mission has always been to advocate for the role that this group can play. What's been really interesting for me as I step out of that now, I will always be a division, I'll always be part of the BACP as a member, but stepping out of that now, for me, the next stage of my journey is to work more broadly beyond the BACP as well. So be part of the BACP, but also work with other membership, other people, other practitioners, and bodies across the world of coaching and therapy, because there's so much that we have to learn from each other. I'm a member of the EMCC, so I'm accredited with them. I'm closely linked in with several people who are members of the ICF. I've also more interested, learned more recently around health coaching and what that involves, as I'm investigating what therapeutic coaching means to different people, and also coaching psychology. With the BPS, they've got their own division. So I'm learning more and more about how the integration for me is not just within these sort of siloed communities, but it's across all of us. What can we all keep learning from each other? What are the strengths of each way of working that we can all be aware of, so that ultimately we have these brilliant, ever more robust methods and understanding of what's going to help people the most. I think
I totally agree. We have ourselves created an advisory board. It consists of about 40 people and it grows steadily. of people from all four corners of the planet and from a whole series of different disciplines, roughly 20% academic, 80% practitioners, and we meet 4 times a year. And it's where all our ideas are born. And so for us, learning, as Peter said, we learn all the time. When we started way, way back in, I think it was 1993, Peter, or 1994, and Peter produced the first version of the 4Cs in 2002. We're a long way on from that. Not, you know, the core picture's always been the same. We've been able to add and add and add to it. So now we've got something that we feel is powerful. But mentioning the 4Cs gives me a chance to move on to the 3Cs. And this is your concept, which you promote through your organization, 3Cs Coach. Can you tell us about the 3Cs and what inspired you to find the 3Cs? You can't create them, you find them, don't you?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the 3Cs came about once I'd qualified as an executive coach and begun working and wanting to describe what I felt I offered to clients. Whilst also, you know, helping people understand the differences as I saw them then between coaching and psychotherapy. So the 3Cs, when that emerged about 5 years ago now, I suppose, the 3Cs are clarity, confidence, and change. And I felt that those three words bridge the gap between executive coaching and psychotherapy as I offered them as distinct and separate practices now. Interestingly, I think I was already integrating my work because I still think that it makes sense now. I mean, I have a separate consultancy now, which is therapeutic coaching consultancy, which very much is around that formal integration. But the words clarity, confidence, and change, I think, are still true and in alignment with what I feel is what people like myself can offer people. Clarity around the situation and themselves, building confidence that change is possible, and empowering them to understand their strengths. And then the change is the final stage, which comes last in the process around, well, what does that actually look and feel like, and how can we support you to actively make that change happen? And of course it iterates. It's not a linear process.
Yeah.
But that's how it came about.
So I'll let Peter step in, Mr. 4Cs.
Yeah. So again, yes, yeah, there's overlap, there's similarities, yeah, there's slightly different approaches. But if I take the 4Cs, confidence is one of them. I mean, confidence is at the core of many activities. But then if you look at just challenge, control, and commitment, the other C's, that's the way to make it happen. So it ties into your so you've got the confidence to change, and I think it's that linkage, confidence to change to the change. We're operating in that space, and also back on the clarity, because trying to help people understand themselves, because the great problem, you'll be aware as I am, you only know what you know about you. So sometimes a normative approach, you compare to somebody, helps you understand, the situation. But I can see that the 3Cs and 4Cs how they integrate, and there's always a professor lag with me. I'm about 10 minutes behind the discussion, but it's from what you're saying, preventative coaching is where there's a gap and where we would like to operate, because probably 20% of my work would be crisis. This has happened. Go and look at mental substance. What can we do? But a lot of our work, 80% of it, working with younger people often, is showing them what they are, which is the clarity, showing them absolutely you can change, and then giving them tools and techniques, but not change them. The balance over the years, which I've tried to develop, because I started off more simplistic, coming from a sports psychology background. The balance is you don't fundamentally change your persona, but you can change how you cope with the world. There is no ideal model out there. There's tools, a technique, there's understanding, body or term, clarity, confidence, and a change orientation. But there's no specific ideal model. And that tends to be where we operate. But understanding it, so it goes back to that clarity, understanding the foundation, where you're at. So how do you know you're a sensitive person? Yeah, because often people call you sensitive. But then if I look at some of the great gender imbalances in the world, funny enough, when we do big studies, females are often seen as less mentally tough than males. And actually, when we measure them, they're not. It's expressed differently. These are generic averages. There's more emotional expressivity. Example. So sometimes, and you must find it, what people's challenges are is what people's told them. It's not them. You've been told you're not very good at stuff. Sometimes to break that cycle and get into that change cycle, it's just giving people some evidence. That's what we like to do. So is that clarity aspect? But we're all moving towards that change. We're moving towards that change orientation. Little strides, little moves forwards. It's not a magic wand. There's no magical solution. But generally, I can see how there's definitely a merger of the ideas. I will borrow, as I say, I do always learn on these podcasts, but the idea of preventative coaching is, I didn't realise that's what I was doing, but that's what I'm doing. I'm giving people a preparation for the oncoming storm. As you say, they might be in the pub thinking, it's not great, and that could be better, things could be better. That's a different thing. But allowing people to build resilience, build mental toughness for what could happen is a good skill. And what we've learned over the last 5 years is we don't want to make everybody mentally tough. That's not a mission in any way. But the sensitive people need to be able to act tough when the wind's really blowing. Because what we've found is one of the advantages of being more sensitive is it's always challenging. There's always something. Whereas you're really mentally tough, you take unawares when something really bad happens, which you can't deal with because you've always been to deal with it. So understanding yourself, that clarity, understanding tools and techniques, and the confidence thing I'm really on board with is because just like yourself. Sometimes we've been criticised in the past because we never said it, but it's what people assume is we're saying somebody has to be like that. You have to be an extrovert. You have to be mentally tough. You have to be a feeler. It's just understanding what you are, accepting what you are, and if you don't like what you are, change it. Simple, really. So all that stuff builds in, and I wish I had the therapeutic skills to get into that domain, but it's not a strength of mine or a qualification, because sometimes that's the end of what I can do. I can operate well within normal range. I can recognise mental health issues, and as you know, huge difference between chronic anxiety and somebody being anxious. Where it can be really effective is somebody's got an exam tomorrow. But I started off my career working with elite sports people, and the great problem, and you've alluded to it in coaching, is I got asked in the day before a cup final. Bit late, lads, and it usually was lads in this case. Give me the junior players at 17. Build this stuff, this discussion, these coaching techniques throughout, and then when something happens, you're in a really, really good position. But that acute problem, I'm sure coaches and people doing what I do can help, but it's slightly frustrating because it is, it's damage limitation. And I think what we all want from the discussion is the damage not to occur in the first place. And people, some psychologists cause quite a few issues because they tell people what's wrong with them. They just classify them as your problem is you're not assertive enough or whatever it is. And that's not the problem. The problem is some of the assertive behavior, for example, might cause some issues at some points, and how do they deal with that? But I spend the most of my time in my early discussions with people undoing what people have told them. Because somebody's told them somewhere, and the internet is not our friend in this thing, because they've taken a test somewhere which says that that's what they're like, and you think, yeah, not so good. So yeah, I was reading your 3 C's a bit before this discussion, and I thought, yeah, in my typical way, cool. That's it there. That's good. I can see how as a process where what we source and we do supports. Yeah, because at worst, because I've been saying all along, sometimes there's no fit at all. But yeah, generally, I can see where that would lie in that changing from the confidence, developing confidence to actually changing, and then from getting that clarity. So, and it goes back to Doug's point, about psychometrics in general. They're really good at clarity, as long as it's a proper psychometric and properly explained and properly qualified. And how do we know that's the case? Is because sometimes they're not right. Mostly they are, but sometimes it's a tyranny of numbers. If I say you're a 9 on something, and you say that doesn't sound like me, I listen to what you tell me. I don't keep going down, but actually, you must be a 9 because my test said you're a 9. What we want is a starting point of a discussion.
Absolutely. There's so much you've said there that is really, really interesting. I want to respond to, and it's where to start. But one of the things that you were talking about there is one of the things that you find yourself working with a lot are what we would call self-limiting beliefs. So the beliefs that someone's developed that are limiting themselves, that are not necessarily true, and they've come from somewhere, and that really resonates strongly with me. And what interests me most in the early sessions is trying to understand, when I meet somebody, what does this person believe about themselves in the world?
Yeah.
And then what has happened to this person in their lives to make them understand this and experience this?
I can't help, because I'm starting off with the performance psychologist is my starting point. So something like that. People tell me they can't play a musical instrument. Now, there could be a good reason, because people laughed at them like me when a 7-year-old with a recorder. I was a bit devastatingly bad with a recorder. So I've been known to bring ukuleles along. I can teach somebody how to play a reasonable tune in 30 minutes. Now, that's trivial in itself, but it's building what you're saying, that you can show things can change, and then you can get onto the proper change.
Well, so it's interesting, because it's what you're talking about there is the difference between the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. And ultimately, if you can start to be in a world where actually we're not saying you can do everything, but what we're saying is don't start from the position that it might be possible for you to do everything, and that it might be possible for these things to happen, is suddenly in a very different place. But the important thing about doing that is, if you've always been in a world where there's certainty, where things are black or they're white, they're right or they're wrong, or you can or you can't, what you're asking someone to do is step into a world that's uncertain, and that can feel very, very vulnerable. Okay, and this is what happens in this, the earlier stages are about building the relationship and helping people to say, well, what if that thing you think about yourself, or that thing you think about your boss, or that thing you think about your family, or that thing you think that's awful about you or brilliant about you, what if that's all something you've just learned? What would it be like for us to explore if things might be different? And then out of that, you can come to lots of different places. But it's really, and I think what's really, really important is the work that we do is really about strengths. It's about us understanding who we are as people. What are our strengths? What are our perceived weaknesses or vulnerabilities? and then allowing us to sit in the space of what's, what's another way to look at this. So, for example, around this idea of sensitivity, I would, where I come from, I come from a very working class background. Being sensitive was not seen as a strength at all. I actually am a very sensitive person, and I now see it's particularly in the work that I do now, it's probably one of my strengths. So, and that's very much about how I've had to reframe my understanding of who I am, accept who I am, and possibly put down some of the behaviors that I developed in an earlier age that I thought kept me safe in the world. I've had to relearn how to be myself and learn that I can still be safe without these safety mechanisms that I had around myself.
That's really, really interesting, Lucy, because we often are asked about the term mental toughness because some people recoil at the term toughness. We can't do anything about it. It's the correct technical term for what it is. We've stopped using strengths and weaknesses because as soon as you tell somebody this is a weakness or even discuss a weakness, they think they've got a weakness. We talk about advantage and disadvantage. So somebody that is slow, careful, pedantic, in one setting will have an advantage, in another setting they'll have a disadvantage. I think it's quite wrong to call them strengths and weaknesses because they're not inherent to the individual, they're a function of the environment. You are who you are, understand who you are, and optimize who you are. Yeah?
I
Change
love
the
that.
environment if you can, but you can't, you rarely can. So yes, you're slow, pedantic, and somebody will say, oh, he never keeps up or she never keeps up. But actually, in some situations, that is a big advantage because you might make fewer mistakes than the hare,
Yeah, there's so much there around reframing,
Yeah.
isn't there? So, for example, with that person, if they were to come to me and say, well, my colleagues perceive me as slow and pedantic, they would, and then I'll bring in for a moment some of the more psychometric side of things. They would be sitting in a particular box as somebody who is probably more analytical, for example. And so I'd say, well, are you slow, or what's another word to use slow? Well, it might be careful, it might be accurate. So and suddenly that is a strength then, isn't it? It's a strength that they bring that they might be perceived by themselves as something that's different. It's so much as about perception. But yeah, I really take your point about
I suppose what we're trying to do is to get away from the talking about weaknesses. So we use the advantage and disadvantage because that kind of changes the language and changes the discussion.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Yeah, because language is so important, isn't it?
Yeah.
Language is really, really important. Yeah, and it's interesting for me. It's about what does somebody think is a weakness of themselves? Even if we don't use that word, what is it they think makes them less at a disadvantage in the world? And let's look at that.
So this is going to your point of creating self-awareness, creating clarity about who you are. So if I know that I'm somebody that is going to be more careful because I want to make sure that I get every step right, I've got to learn to see that as an advantage, not a disadvantage. And that sometimes it'll emerge as a strength in a situation, and some people will see that as a weakness. But I'm okay because that's me, and I know when it works and when it doesn't.
Absolutely. And this is where it's very interesting in teams, and for me, in the work that I do and in my consultancy, we have lots of experts who are accredited psychometric tests. Whenever I work with somebody, I always ask, what psychometric testing results have you got already? And I always look at them, but for me, they're just one piece of a puzzle. Whenever I work with anyone, it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. And there's so many different elements. There's so many different parts of the pieces of the puzzle. Some of them they'll be very aware of. Some of those pieces of the puzzle they might not be aware of, and we might not even ever get to them. They might be in the unconscious bracket, which is the more sort of deeper psychological psychodynamic work, and we never go to those places. But I think the important thing is about my perspective on psychometric tests is they can have value and they can be useful. They tell me a little bit about how that person has presented themselves in their conscious world as they answer that test. So that's useful for me. That's useful data about whether they come up as an ENTJ or not. But also I'll also want to know, is there a shadow side of them that they're not seeing, that they're keeping at bay, that is going to be really important for me to get to know and for them to get to know? Because the more deeply you understand yourself from a holistic perspective, the more knowledge you have about who you are, and how you want to be and how you can be in the world, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. And, I think we would probably go more than talking about the shadow side, because John Perry is a great fan about talking about the complexity of human nature. It's not two facets, it's many facets. So, and I think our gripe with things like, you mentioned MBTI, is it tends to type. It's a very simplistic model. So it says, right, you're in this box. And that doesn't give you the ability to see these different facets. So completely agree with you. I do.
Yeah, I agree as well. And I guess that comes back to that point of, I think one of the things that we can offer in any of our relationships, whether it's coaching or psychotherapy or coaching psychologist or a health coach, is a space for somebody to feel safe to explore, to let down some of those things that they might have been holding around themselves to keep them safe, and to see what might emerge that's new in that space.
Yeah. Well, I'm the non-coach here, but I really appreciate two things you've been talking about. That's creating the safe space, because you can only get to that person through that, in that safe space. But you have consistently used the term relationships. And yet, with a lot of coaches, they'll talk about process, especially things like grow. It was interesting. You're in very good company here, Lucy, because about 6-7 weeks ago, we had a very elite coach, David Clutterbuck. And he said, we have to move from process to relationships. True coaching is based on relationships. So you're echoing that.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree. The core of my training, and this comes back to this belief that change is possible, is that we learn who we are in the world in relationship with other people. From the moment we're born, we are vulnerable because we have to rely on other people in order to be safe. So from the moment we're born, we're learning how to be looked after and how to keep ourselves safe. And we grow up and we learn that, and then our brain trims things and we lose things, and it becomes part of our unconscious, it becomes part of our psyche, and we grow through childhood into adulthood, and we end up with these truths of our existence about who we are, what our personality is, what people like about us, what people don't like about us. And we've learned all of that in relationship with the people that have been around us, whether that's our parents, whether that's our family, whether that's our teachers, whether that's the people that live on our street, in our community. All of those factors we've learned by being in relationship with other people. So the way that we change is through our relationship with somebody else. And the relationship we have and we develop with our coach or our therapist or that person that we build that bond of trust with is therefore an important part of that. And I don't believe you need to be a psychotherapist with experience of transference and countertransference and projective identification and all that. It might help for you to be able to put some terms on it. But ultimately, if you then start to build that bond of trust, remember I was saying about that, do I trust this person enough to start to think about the areas of grey that exist in who I am? That's when the change is happening. And it will feel uncomfortable, You know, and I often say to my clients, if you're not feeling uncomfortable, you're probably not changing and growing. So it's probably going to feel uncomfortable if you're in that space, but you're changing as a result of this in a healthy way.
Lucy, I think that's a great point at which to stop. And I think we have to stop because I've got an urge to carry on this conversation. There's lots of stuff we could talk about. I thought, oh, she's raised trust. There's loads to talk about on trust. So I really appreciate you coming on. I love the ideas and the thoughts that you've presented. Peter, I don't know if you got a final word to.
No, a final word is that preventative coaching, and I think trust. I will go back to, and I think the coach, the therapist, has to be an honest broker. Has to do what's right for the client, not what they can do, what the coachee needs. I think it is a great scheme. So it's all a big smorgasbord of ideas when you get little bits from little bits, and as you say, build a picture of the client, but. Yeah, it's different every time. So it's just not getting locked in the technique. As Doug was saying, it's getting locked into the relationship.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me. You know, this has just reinforced my belief and my excitement of continually working with different people with different backgrounds, with different areas of expertise, because it's only ever really, really helpful. And therefore, it's only ever going to help our clients and the people we work with, as well as ourselves as practitioners in this space. So thank you very much for the opportunity to have this conversation.
It's a pleasure. If people want to get hold of you, Lucy, how can they get hold of you?
They can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, or they can check out either of my websites. So there's www.the3cscoach.com, or they can find out more about my community of consultants at therapeuticcoachingconsultancy.co.uk.
Brilliant. Thank you again.
You're so welcome.